Dave's mother, Margaret, and Smith Gardner, retired fire chief, married more than a year, but barely more than a year, were sitting at the kitchen table eating lunch. Campbell's tomato soup, grilled cheese sandwiches, and butterscotch pudding. They made it to the pudding, and Margaret was telling Smith one of her favorite stories, the story of Puccini's last opera, Turandot, which happened to be one of her favorite operas. It was part of an ongoing campaign to educate Smith, not in the ways of the world. Smith Gardner was already wise in the ways of the world, in the ways of her world. Campaign wasn't going as well as she would have liked. Smith was a sweet and kind man. She loved having him around her. She loved cooking for him. She enjoyed his company. They enjoyed each other's company. Yet there was no denying it. This business of a second marriage, all these little adjustments, it was surprisingly tough. He didn't finish the final duet, said Margaret. Who? Said Smith, putting down his spoon and staring at her earnestly. Puccini, said Margaret, a little peevishly. Right, said Smith. First, said Margaret, he was sick and then he died. So he couldn't finish, said Smith, showing her that he could keep up. So his friend finished it for him, said Margaret. Is that allowed, said Smith? Not against the rules? There are no rules, said Margaret. This is art, Smith. So his friend finished it. Then the great Toscanini agreed to conduct the world premiere, La Scala. Smith raised his spoon in the air as if he were conducting an orchestra, and Margaret smiled. But when Toscanini reached the last scene, she said, the scene the friend had written, he put his baton down and he turned his back on the orchestra, and everything ground to a halt. The two of them stared at each other for an uncomfortable moment. Smith lowered his hands, and then he said, "Why'd he do that?" "Well," said Margaret, "this is a very famous moment. Toscanini turned to the audience and announced that the maestro had not completed the opera. And then he said, 'Death is stronger than art.' And that would be as far as they would go that night." Margaret looked exhilarated. Smith looked puzzled. Smith said, "Did everyone boo?" "There was dead silence," said Margaret, until someone in the audience yelled out at the top of their lungs. "I know what he yelled," said Smith. "He yelled, 'I want my money back.'" "No," said Margaret. "He yelled, 'Viva Puccini!' And they all stood up, gave a big ovation." This made no sense to Smith at all. "You'd think they'd want their money back," said Smith. Smith had a fiercely pragmatic heart, and Margaret loved him for it. But she wasn't used to it. Her late husband, Charlie, loved her story about Puccini, loved it. Of course, Charlie loved everything about music. Charlie kept a ukulele in the truck, played it while he drove, used his knees to steer. Margaret and Charlie fit together so easily. Sometimes it felt that it's hard to put in words, like there was an unanswered question hovering between her and Smith. And like any unresolved question, it kept coming up, demanding her attention. There in June, when she told him about the opera, and then when her grandson Sam and his best friend Murphy came to spend some of the summer with them. And Margaret had to hustle the boys off each morning before Smith could get to them. She made them sandwiches and pushed them outside to play before Smith could push them into the garden and get them pulling weeds or laying down mulch. "Boys should be working," said Smith. "Boys should be boys," said Margaret. There was no doubt about it. Margaret and Smith were still getting used to one another's ways. But Sam was her grandson, so she held trump. And Smith was wise enough not to make her play it. So instead of working, the boys played. Margaret never asked where they had been or what they were up to. It was summer. She knew what they were up to. They were up to nothing. And could anything be more perfect for two boys from the city than to drift around Big Narrows, Cape Breton in July and August? It was a summer of corn cobs and popsicles, of dandelions and frogs, ice cream cones and the old wrecked car on the mountain road, And then one night, there were shooting stars. It was a night Sam and Murphy will never forget. They were in the backyard, lying on the soft grass. The sky couldn't have been blacker. The stars couldn't have been closer or further away. It was hard to tell. Close and far at the same time. A constellation of confusion. They'd been lying there for maybe half an hour, lying on their backs, head to head, lost from the world of words, when Murphy said, "Did you see that?" Like a flash from a camera, except longer and streakier. From one side of the sky, right across to the other. The two of them sat up abruptly and stared at each other in wonder. It was there, and then it was gone. And whatever it was had flared into the atmosphere of their imaginations like a galloping horse. A wave of a hand, a blink of the eye, and they would have missed it, but neither of them blinked. Oh, yes, Sam had seen it all right. "What was that?" said Sam. Murphy's eyes were bulging, but he didn't say anything. It was like he was in a trance. "Murphy?" said Sam. "Aliens." It was aliens. And then there was another, and then another, and Murphy said, "It's happening. They're coming." The boys ran inside. Inside, it was an August night like any other. Margaret was sitting on the couch knitting, and Smith was sitting beside her in his big green chair. The television was on. They were watching the news, oblivious that the biggest news of all was just outside. "We saw a UFO," said Sam. "3," said Murphy. They were hardly the first boys from the city to stare up into the night and be fooled by a shooting star. "Ah," said Smith, smiling, sitting up. Margaret knew what was coming. These were the sort of moments Smith loved. He was about to explain. He was about to say something about comets and meteors and cosmic hoo-ha. "Ah," said Smith. But he didn't get any further than that because Margaret didn't let him. Before he said one more word, Margaret shot him a look. "What?" said Smith. And Margaret shot him another look, and then she turned to the boys and she said, "Tell us what you saw." "Right across the sky," said Murphy. "Right over town." "3 of them," said Sam, one after the other. "Like a flash from a camera," said Margaret, "except faster and streakier." "Exactly," said both boys together. "How did you know?" said Sam. "Well," said Margaret, "you're not the first ones around here to see something like that." And then she glanced at Smith. Smith was frowning at her. Margaret frowned back. An hour later, the boys were upstairs. They were lying in bed, but they were light years from sleep. "Did you see your grandfather?" said Murphy. "He didn't like her talking about it," said Sam. "She didn't tell us everything she knew," said Murphy. "You could tell. Did you see the look she gave him?" They talked for over an hour, lying on their beds under the sloping roof, feeling smaller and smaller until they felt so small they felt like they were floating. In the living room, Smith turned off the television. "Why didn't you want me to tell them?" he said. Margaret was folding up her knitting. "What?" she said. "That it was just a shooting star?" "A meteor," said Smith, "not a star. Probably no bigger than a grain of salt." Margaret stared at him. "That's the truth," said Smith. "Smith," she said, "what sort of fun can a boy have with a grain of salt?" "But those are the facts," said Smith. "Smith Gardner," said Margaret, "life would be tedious if all we did was stick to the facts." Sam couldn't remember falling to sleep that night, but he slept deep and he dreamed of the golden flare from a monstrous spaceship. When he opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was Murphy, already dressed, sitting by the window, staring out. "How long you been up?" said Sam. Maybe they didn't land, said Murphy. Maybe they crashed. And so they had breakfast, and they crashed out the back door and onto their bikes. We'll start at Macaulay's, said Murphy. Start what? Said Sam. The search, said Murphy. As they pedaled over the green iron bridge on the edge of town, Sam said, why Macaulay's? Because, said Murphy, Macaulay has the only cows in town. There are almost always mutilated cows. Macaulay's cows were fine. You're sure? Said Murphy. All of them? They were standing in the farmyard in front of the barn, the boys straddling their bikes, old man Macaulay leaning on his tractor. I only have the one cow, said old man Macaulay. It isn't hard to keep track. The boys found the piece of spaceship 2 days later in the woods on Macaulay's mountain, a piece of shiny metal about the size of a cookie sheet. In fact, if you didn't know better, you might have thought it was a cookie sheet. It was half buried under some old leaves not far from Macaulay's sugar shack. This could be from a wing, said Sam. Or a tail stabilizer, said Murphy. It could be radioactive, said Sam. They collected soil samples from beside it. They didn't want to touch it, so they used a stick to push it into the backpack. They showed it to Margaret as soon as they got home. Do you think it's radioactive? Said Margaret. Smith, who was reading the paper at the kitchen table, snorted derisively. They thought about selling it on eBay. But they decided against that. It was too valuable for eBay. Besides, said Margaret, you wouldn't want it falling into the wrong hands. Exactly, said Murphy. Then Margaret looked at Smith and said, maybe you should take the boys down to see Chief Kavanaugh. Smith stared at her in amazement, and then he nodded at her slightly as if to say, I give up. Chief Kavanaugh was sitting at his desk at the police station with a morning crossword in front of him when the boys arrived. He looked up and smiled, said, you're the lads who found the spaceship. Murphy let out a long, contented sigh. Sam said, piece of a spaceship. Chief Kavanaugh pushed the paper aside and examined the piece of metal carefully. Do you think it's radioactive? He said. Then he reached for a pen and wrote in his logbook. It was Chief Kavanaugh who suggested they send it to the government. It was Margaret who told them that the government was a mansion of many rooms and they should choose their room carefully. She sent them to the Big Narrows library. They spent 3 hours huddled over the library's single computer. They argued about where they should send it. To the RCMP? The Space Agency? The Department of Defense? Foreign Affairs? What about the Dairy Commission, said Sam. What? Said Murphy. Because of the mutilated cows, said Sam. How about tourism, said Murphy. They could be tourists. They narrowed it down to 3. Citizenship and Immigration, the Refugee Board, and CBDC. What's that? Said Sam. Cape Breton Development Corporation, said Murphy. Perfect, said Sam. They left with an address written on a tiny scrap of paper. That night they sat down to draft a letter. Murphy dictated, Sam wrote. Murphy said, okay. Murphy said, start with this. We found this in Area 27. Area 27, said Sam. That's just the way governments talk, said Murphy. So Murphy paced and Sam sat at the table trying to keep up. Wait, he said, not so fast. How do you spell mutilated? I don't know, said Murphy. M-E-W. Sam wrote, there are no dead cows. Murphy added, as far as we have seen. Sam added, but Macaulay's cow seems cranky. There are no dead cows as far as we have seen, but Macaulay's cow seems cranky. Good, said Murphy. They placed the letter and the piece of metal along with some of the dirt they had dug up into a cardboard box, and they wrapped the box in brown paper, and they took it to the post office, and they used their allowance to mail it to Ottawa. That night after supper, the boys washed the dishes. As they worked, they argued about some of the things they had been arguing about all summer. Whether gerbils were more fun than hamsters. If Sasquatches existed in Canada or just in Russia. And what it would be like if Martians landed and they barked like dogs. And only dogs could understand them and not humans. When they finished, they walked to town. They said they were going for ice cream. Down the hill in front of the house. As lost in their conversation as two rabbinical students. As he stood on the porch and watched them go, Smith felt a pang. His boyhood summers seemed so close and so far. When she heard how much the package had cost to mail to Ottawa, Margaret began to wonder if Smith was right. Sure, they were smart boys. Sure, they would figure things out in their own time, but maybe it was a small treachery not to tell the truth always. Maybe I was wrong, Smith, she said one night. The two boys were already up in their room reading. Charlie and I, she began, and then she stopped and she started again. Maybe Charlie and I didn't think these things through enough. Smith set his tea towel down and put his hand on Margaret's arm. Smith said, I think it's me who doesn't think things through. I think you have things just about right. I just enjoy stories, said Margaret, more than facts. I like the mystery and the tension. Aha, said Smith. That's why you married me. Margaret laughed too, but she didn't contradict him. She went into the living room and settled into her chair with her knitting. Smith disappeared upstairs. He rooted around at the back of the bedroom closet. He was looking for his old binoculars. When he found them, he crossed the hall and knocked on the boys' bedroom door. Come on, he said. Once he got them downstairs, he handed them the binoculars. It's a beautiful night, he said. Don't waste it. They lay down on the lawn, and he laid down beside them. They laid down and looked up. August stars. Margaret saw them out the kitchen window. Her 3 boys sprawled on the grass. She made hot chocolate. When she took it out, Sam handed her the binoculars. Look at the moon, he said. Look at the moon. They stayed until it got cold and the boys began to yawn. Margaret took them in. When she came back out, Smith was sitting on the porch stairs, still staring at the sky. She stood beside him for a few minutes, the two of them quiet until Smith said, "A penny for your thoughts?" "I was thinking of Charlie," said Margaret. "He would have loved this summer." "Did you miss him?" said Smith. "Seems so long ago," said Margaret. "Another life." And Smith patted the stair beside him and said, "Sit down." And she sat beside him, and then she shivered, and Smith stood up and took off his cardigan and draped it around her shoulders. When he sat down again, she leaned into him, and they sat there staring up at the sky together. "There's plenty of time for them to learn that there are no mysteries left in the world," said Margaret. "There's not close enough time for that," said Smith. "There are more mysteries than time will ever give us." Another star flew across the sky. Phew! "How long do you think I'll get?" said Smith. "Like a flash from a camera," said Margaret, "except brighter and streakier." Smith laughed. His laugh rose up into the night sky, up to the window where Murphy was sitting, his book abandoned upside down on his bed, But the sound of the old man's laughter barely made an impression, because up in the attic, Murphy was looking up too. "Come here," he whispered to Sam. "Come and see. It's happening again."